It is Wednesday, June 3rd. I'm Sam Seder.
And I'm Lucie Steiner. Which one of these stories will you be talking about today?
Which story, indeed? There are curfews in place and state-sponsored crimes underway across America. The world is watching in horror as Donald Trump, Bill Barr, and the Pentagon brass and an army of cops turn the arsenal of an empire against its citizens. Meanwhile, there were elections in a number of states yesterday, but Trump's Dictator Act, not to mention Corona, made a free and fair vote all but impossible. And lastly, Minnesota, where the uprisings in Floyd's name began, elected officials are now talking seriously about disbanding a corrupt police department, and a lot more.
You're listening to Majority.fm's AM Quickie, and these are the stories you need to know.
You may be hearing different things about what happened in the United States yesterday, depending on where you live and who you are. Propaganda and disinformation abound, and not just on social media. But here's what people in other countries are hearing about our situation. From The Guardian: soldiers reportedly poised outside of Washington as curfews set in. From the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong: protesters defy curfew in New York after Trump threatens crackdown. From Deutsche Welle: Germany urges press freedoms at U.S. protests. This is a serious problem. For you, us, everyone, journalists, dissidents, and human rights advocates are at this moment being targeted by police, paramilitaries, and at least some of the armed forces. Hundreds have already been arrested around the country. Hundreds more have been attacked without provocation. Government agents are committing crimes on American soil, and it is no secret. It is streamed and broadcast live around the world. At the same time, top military commanders have announced they were unaware of developments unfolding around them. By all evidence, these developments seem to be directed by the ruling Republican Party in cooperation with Donald Trump, organized crime, and a faction of the state security forces at the direction or influence of Attorney General Bill Barr. Mainstream press reports, including by correspondents for national networks, offered ample video evidence that the forces carrying out Trump's crackdown have at times inflamed, exploited, and at times even stage-managed this crisis. Nationwide protest movement has, in a matter of days, led to a full-blown authoritarian crackdown by the executive branch. The integrity of the Congress and the judiciary is uncertain, and even federal court buildings have been filled with soldiers. Here is more of our latest information. As of yesterday, before curfew, there were at least 550 active protests in all 50 states. Arrests of demonstrators began on both coasts before the announced start of the curfew. Shown among the marches in Washington, D.C., Massachusetts Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren told World Press that Trump was, quote, imposing violence on our people, end quote. The U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division was deployed to Washington, D.C. from North Carolina. These were active duty forces deployed against civilians and armed with bayonets. Videos showed some soldiers mixing with crowds and appearing ill at ease with their mission. Others, taking up riot formations, engaged in brutality. One resident reported his daughter picked up an unexploded police grenade that could have seriously injured her. Reporters spotted new secret police around D.C. who wear no insignia and who only say that they work for Barr's Department of Justice. Barr granted the Drug Enforcement Agency extraordinary powers to surveil and arrest protesters, and Trump sought to federalize the D.C. Police Department. In New York City, Mayor Bill de Blasio, whose daughter was arrested and threatened by police yesterday, praised the police even as they attacked thousands of his constituents on the Manhattan Bridge and around the city. Police even boasted over public radio channels about shooting protesters. In Portland, Oregon, protesters intentionally took a bridge laid down in a show of passive resistance, but activists reported pre-curfew visits by police, and they, along with journalists and the homeless, were gassed indiscriminately. In Los Angeles, police backed by soldiers dragged groups of people out of cars for no apparent reason. In Denver, one officer bragged on social media that the police were starting a riot. In Florida and some other states, local law enforcement urged homeowners to take up arms to defend against any criminals who threaten their property. Across the country, mayors and congressional representatives offered little in the way of substantive resistance. Even Republicans refused to comment on their own leader's violent and treasonous power grab. The alleged driver of a semi-truck that plowed into a protest in Minnesota on Sunday night was released yesterday by the county attorney without any charges being filed. There were primary elections in 8 states in the District of Columbia. Joe Biden reportedly swept in most states with between 61 and 85% of the vote. Bernie Sanders, who suspended his campaign but also hoped to keep collecting delegates, did best in Rhode Island with nearly 30% of the vote. He did worst in Maryland with only 6%. In New Mexico, former CIA operative Valerie Plame lost her bid for Congress to a progressive, Teresa Leger Fernandez. In Iowa, a white nationalist Republican Representative Steve King lost his primary to Randy Finstra. The results were a mixed bag for progressive candidates in Maryland, Montana, South Dakota, and D.C., all of which had elections scheduled for yesterday. But it is hard to imagine anyone, including professional elections monitors from this country and other countries, ever accepting the results as perfectly legitimate. Here's the thing. You would expect some questions about the quality of yesterday's vote, given the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the military and police curfews around the country, and widespread reports of voter intimidation and suppression by forces loyal to Trump. But that was only the beginning of the problems. The Washington Post reported that in several places, in-person voting was severely restricted. The number of polling locations were cut back. Complete results were not available. Some states said they won't be ready until next week. Lines were long, and voters reported feelings of intimidation and confusion around dates and deadlines.
Majority.fm's AM Quickie is fueled by JustCoffee.coop. Just Coffee is a worker-owned coffee roaster based in Madison, Wisconsin that has sponsored the Majority Report for nearly a decade. Check out their collection of fair trade roasts, including our own Majority Report blend. And regardless of what you order, receive 10% off your order when you use the code MAJORITY at checkout. And all shipping is free. That's coupon code MAJORITY at JustCoffee.coop.
As stark and frightening as the news has been, there's also been many hopeful and heartening signs. George Floyd by 4 city cops inspired the nationwide Democratic uprisings. One ward representative spoke of dramatic changes that might have seemed impossible 2 weeks ago. The city's Ward 3 representative, Steve Fletcher, said he was working with other members of the council to totally disband the Minnesota Police Department. From there, the council could, quote, start fresh with a community-oriented, nonviolent public safety and outreach capacity, end quote. Fletcher also described how police had traditionally extorted council members by allowing crime to increase in their districts as punishment for unfavorable votes and by intimidating local business owners to lobby on the department's behalf. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison filed a civil rights lawsuit against the MPD. The state's Human Rights Commissioner, Rebecca Lucero, joined the complaint. She told local TV their first goal was to negotiate a consent decree with the city. Then courts could enforce it by issuing injunctions and unspecified financial penalties. In the meantime, the popular movement for justice for George Floyd continued to take positive action that is too often unreported. A group of protesters took over a former Sheraton hotel in an area that reportedly saw theft, vandalism, and arson. The building now houses 200 people who were previously homeless for free, and it's managed by volunteers. We'll see how that goes, but in the meantime, at least people are not in the street, more likely in this new age of arbitrary curfews, in jail.
And now for some quicker quickies.
Quicker Quickie.
The World Health Organization funded a major new study that suggests the U.S. Centers for Disease Control has been dangerously compromised by Trump's personal interests. The journal Lancet published an analysis funded by the World Health Organization of 172 different studies about the effectiveness of N95 respirator masks versus ordinary surgical masks to protect against the coronavirus. The New York Times says the new study confirms what scientists were already saying about the importance of medical personnel and other high-risk workers actually having N95 masks to wear. The police seem to have plenty. When financial markets reopened this week, Goldman Sachs bet against the U.S. dollar. Goldman, which looted the Treasury so thoroughly in 2008, has now established short positions on the value of the dollar. Details are complicated, but the upshot is that the more expensive and difficult things get for you as the economy suffers under Trumpism, the more Goldman wins. A rare cyclone headed for Mumbai last night had prompted tens of thousands to evacuate the city on India's west coast. According to the BBC, it would be the first major cyclone to hit the city in over a century. The Indian Meteorological Department was calling it a severe cyclonic storm. The poor will suffer worse, and the government is no help. 2 weeks ago, another cyclone hit the east coast of India and Bangladesh. Banking regulators in New York have been carrying out a secret investigation of Donald Trump's lender of last resort, Deutsche Bank. But the investigation, reported by the New York Times yesterday, is not like the other investigations into the bank's ties to Trump. It involved Deutsche Bank's relationship with the well-connected serial sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, who died in prison last year. The state's Department of Financial Services wants to know why the bank kept doing business with Epstein after employees raised concerns about his transactions with federal regulators. Unclear if they've tried asking Bill Barr, but he's pretty busy right now.
Quicker, Quickie.
That's all for the AM Quickie. Join us this afternoon on the Majority Report live at noon and later as a podcast.